All right, welcome to our next unit. So we had just did your test as well as your lab practical, all based on the plant kingdom, but we also covered the bacteria kingdom and fungi as well as protists. So last unit we covered 4 different kingdoms, and our last unit, or at least our last unit based on phylogeny, is based on the animal kingdom. We will be learning different phyla like we did with our plants and fungi and protists, but I promise it'll be a whole bunch easier than before, or at least I hope so. That's my goal at least. So, Kingdom Animalia. Here's what you need to know. So first, we need to kind of go over some common characteristics. What makes animals cohesive? What makes something an animal and not a plant? What makes something an animal and not a protist or a fungi? And that's really, really important to distinguish between these different kingdoms. So first, they are eukaryotic. So they're similar to protists and fungi and plants in this regard. Although this is a plant cell, they have organelles like plant cells do. However, our animal cells do lack certain characteristics. For example, they don't have this cell wall that you see in this picture. They also lack these chloroplasts as well as the central vacuole. But they still are eukaryotic, they still have a nucleus, and they still have those membrane-bound organelles. Animals are also strictly multicellular. If you remember, we had some protists that were animal-like, so to speak. Think of an amoeba or even a dinoflagellate. They're moving around. Some of them ingest other things like amoebas. But an amoeba was a single cellular or unicellular organism, whereas all of our animals are multicellular. Obviously, some are larger than others, but still, nonetheless, they are all multicellular organisms. Another thing that brings animals together that differentiates them specifically from fungi and protists is that they have tissues. So these organisms, or animal organisms, or organisms in general, have cells. That's what unites all living things. However, in our animal species, and to a degree in plant species, those cells form these tissues. Essentially, they're multiple cells that are working together for some common goal. For example, muscles. Those are made of muscle cells, but all of those muscle cells working together create that muscle. So create this to do work. Yes, there's one individual muscle cell, but all together they make that tissue. Bones is another example. A single bone cell is a cell, but when you have multiple cells working together, you get the structure that we call bones. And so you don't really see this kind of specialization of cells and specialization of tissues really anywhere except in the animal kingdom. Some more characteristics that bring animals together and differentiate them is that they're heterotrophic. So very obvious discrepancy between our plant kingdom and our animal kingdom. Animals have to rely on getting their nutrition from outside sources. So like in this picture, you have a bear eating a fish. Like the only way that bear is getting any kind of resource, any kind of nutrition is from consuming it from another organism. They can't photosynthesize. Also, at some point in their life cycle, the anything that's considered an animal is mobile. So it doesn't necessarily mean their entire life they are spent in some sort of mobile stage, but at least at some point. And I'm not talking about just sperm. Like I don't mean that can be the only mobile thing. But at some point, whether they're a larvae or an adult, they do have a mobile stage. You don't really even see this, for example, in fungi. Like fungi and plants, very stationary. And some protists are pretty stationary as well. And then finally, one last thing that kind of ties together all of our animal species is most of them are undergoing sexual reproduction. Now, some of them can undergo asexual reproduction as well, but a majority of them undergoing sexual reproduction. For all of the kingdoms we've talked about, including bacteria, some did sexual reproduction, but most of them did asexual reproduction. So a kind of a flip-flop between our animal species and species that were in those other kingdoms. So let's talk about animals specifically. How did we go from these other kingdoms to get present day animals? And animals were kind of last on the list, so to speak. We had decomposers, we had protists and plants, and animals were really the last thing to evolve when looking at all of our kingdoms. So first, we think animals derived from some sort of protist, which kind of makes sense if you think about some similarities between us, particularly movement, and most of them are heterotrophic. But our leading line of evidence that makes us suggest that protists are our common ancestor is actually taking a look at sponges. So sponges live in aquatic environments, and they have these specialized cells that we call choanocytes. So that's what you're seeing in this picture. So if we zoom into a sponge, we see these choanocyte cells, and they're specialized in order to catch food for the sponge. Well, similarly, there is a protist called a choanoflagellate, and the name similarities is no coincidence. We named one after the other because of the similarity in their structure. So we think that protists, particularly these choanoflagellates, form together to create a larger structure. And eventually that larger structure was more beneficial than being individualized. And then we had the development of sponges, which are one of the most primitive animals. So this is currently the leading theory as to where animals even got their roots. So if we look more on a timeline scale, when did that happen? So the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. Life has been around for about 3 billion years. But when I say life, I'm mainly talking about bacteria. Bacteria ruled the world forever. And it's mainly because they can live in those extreme environments which characterized Earth billions and billions of years ago. But when we're talking about our animals, they arose in the Ediacaran period. So this time period was about 540 to 630 million years ago. And, obviously sounds like a very long time ago, but again, keep in mind the age of the Earth being around 4.6 billion years. So to give you kind of a time scale of what's happening in the world, we have plants, we have our primitive plants, mainly we have bacteria, thinking about cyanobacteria particularly, and we also have green algae, so protists. So these organisms are already on Earth. They're dominating these aquatic ecosystems. But this is also around the time that scientists hypothesize as our first life forms from protists. Now we have fossils of life forms, so we know they were here around that period. But taking a look at other things that were there, again, thinking that it was a protist that originally kind of made that leap, evolutionary leap, so to speak, to becoming what we considered an animal. Now these original organisms, we're not talking dinosaurs or anything large, very, very small organisms and soft-bodied, meaning they didn't have a shell, almost jellyfish-like, which should make sense. I mean, the very first organisms or the very first animals we're going to have are going to be pretty primitive in structure, because at this point they're really just a collective of protists. They haven't had those specializations yet to develop larger organisms and more complex organisms, or animals specifically. So this is where it all started. Again, 540 to 640 million years ago. And letting you know now, I will expect you to know the names of these periods. You'll see the names somewhere, so you don't need to memorize how to spell them. But how long ago they occurred, as well as major things that happened during that period. So first animal life. Now following that period is probably a more famous one that you've probably heard of, the Cambrian period. This was about 540 to 490 million years ago. And this time period has been kind of nicknamed the Cambrian explosion. And the reason it was named that is because, scientists are finding tons and tons and tons of fossils from this time period. And so they're suspecting that there is huge amounts of diversification of animals. Now that we kind of have the first footsteps of animals, we now have this entire world and entire ecosystems really to fill. There's tons of niches to be filled, because right now the only thing in those niches are bacteria and protists and some aquatic plants. So there's a lot of diversity that can be housed, so to speak, during this time period and really the early stages of animal life. Now, the kinds of organisms we're talking about are things that we recognize today. For example, echinoderms. So in this picture, echinoderms, this is a sea urchin. That includes starfish as well. Mollusks, so here we see some sort of squid species, octopi, different types of worms, as well as arthropods. Arthropods are like our crabs and our lobsters and whatnot. So organisms we still have today are some of the first ones to diversify in the Cambrian period, 500 million years ago. So it's incredible to think that adaptations they had then have carried them through to present day species. The reason we think the Cambrian explosion happened is we think there was an increase in oxygen in the atmosphere. Therefore, you can support larger organisms because, again, they need that oxygen for cellular respiration. We also think the Earth was, changing a lot, thinking about the continental shelves. Some areas were getting shallower. Essentially, we're creating new uninhabited habitats. So that allowed for more organisms to diversify and adapt to individual niches. Alright, now we're going to one more time period before kind of skipping a lot. The next one, kind of lesser known because it's fairly small, is the Ordovician period. So this happens right after the Cambrian period. So we had this Cambrian explosion of life, and then now we're kind of settling down, like you're not having huge diversification, at least not so much in the water anymore. So this was about 487 to 440 million years ago. And the major thing that happened in this time period were that our plants that were in our oceans and in aquatic ecosystems have now started colonizing land. And so you can kind of see that in this image here, just a depiction of here we had a large diversity of life in the oceans, and evolution favored plants to colonize land because you have this barren entire world, all these continents with nothing on them, but you're now getting fuller and fuller ocean environments, and so it was beneficial for plants to move to land, and those that could colonize land were able to spread more genes, more individuals, etc. Now, with a colonization of plants on land, that means you have a base of your food web on land, meaning organisms that fed on plants could colonize land as well. Now, of course, they're going to have different problems, but food isn't one of them. But again, we're talking very primitive organisms. We're not saying like, oh, this is when crocodiles came out. No. We're talking about like snails, crabs, things that we see today that still have a very intimate relationship with water. They still depend on water, but they can make use of this new ecosystem, this new landmass. They've got the food, they're just now slowly developing adaptations to deal with being dry and being in a dry environment versus being in a strictly aquatic environment.